Hey guys, I was recently approached by Mama. She came to me with a bit of a job offer for the cage, and that was to act as a terrible medical advisor. And the first mystery we're going to tackle is what disease killed Rion. In order to sort of uncover the evidence behind his condition, I trawled through every single story aspect of the game. That includes, character stories, memories, his hidden side stories. I've even gone through his new Recollections of Dusk story. So, just a little spoiler warning, I will be covering all the stories that involve Rion. So if you don't want to know those, click off the video. Anyway, let's get into it. We take a look at Rion's medical history in a sort of chronological fashion. We get some really important info in his sixth hidden story, which is titled Kingship, as well as in the most recent Recollections of Dusk story in part 4. So in the hidden story 6, Kingship, we find out that both Rion and his mother were taken to the medical facility immediately after birth. This just implies that some sort of birth complication may have happened, which sort of leads us down the path. Is there something congenital going on, or was it just simply, a complication of birth? But maybe it's congenital because in part 4 of Recollections of Dusk, in his mother's letter that she leaves for him, she actually apologizes Rion for, quote, passing him to a weak constitution that makes him more susceptible to illness. Whether that's some sort of immunological disease or congenital/genetic disease, we're not too sure yet, but we can look for more clues in other areas of the plot. Next, we can kind of get an idea of Rion's childhood from his EX story. And in that story with the princess where she gets assassinated, and Rion has been plotted to get assassinated, the princess kind of remarks that Rion looks weak, weak for a prince, that he's got a weakened physical state. So from this we can kind of gather that, Rion's had a tough birth and he's been ill since he was a young child, or he at least looked weak as a child. Moving on from the evidence we have so far, it's pretty hard to gauge the chronology of what happens next. We get a few hints about his illness from the main story. Firstly, in chapter 1, in which the kind of narrator or the writing describes Rion's face as appearing drawn and haggard, which means he's sort of looking pale and thin, usually due to sickness. And he eventually becomes so weak when he's dying in the church that he's unable to hold an apple and barely able to speak. It sort of shows that, his conditions become terminal over a number of years rather than causing, acute death, I suppose. In chapter 3 of the main story as well, we just see Rion basically being fatigued, that the cold room kind of burdens his illness, and that kind of implies that it's a respiratory condition. Many chronic respiratory conditions are sort of exacerbated by the cold. Think of things like asthma, COPD, which is kind of like emphysema, I suppose. So that basically narrows down our hunt a little bit, but we can't say definitively that it's a respiratory condition yet. Going on to Rion's regular 2-star character story, he describes that he feels a tightness in his chest, his body grows heavy, he's sweaty, and his illness plans to claim him. He also describes a cough and that he retrieves medicine from his pocket, which he takes. So with this shortness of breath, tightness of his chest, and a cough, we can kind of round out our differential diagnosis a little bit and pretty much put it down to either a cardiac condition or a respiratory condition. So either his heart or his lungs are playing up. Rion's unit stories don't really give much away about his illness, although his Final Fantasy XIV costume in that story, basically he just says he's fatigued and lacking stamina, that he's unable to run around too much. And again, it shows that he's coughing as well, which gives us further evidence to support a respiratory or a cardiac condition. And then in terms of his side stories, we don't get a whole lot except for in Seat of Shadow. The Seat of Shadow side story kind of throws a little bit of a spanner in the works because it describes Rion as having had a seizure. And that doesn't really fit the picture with a lung or a heart condition. However, in people with certain lung conditions, they can get some changes to their blood, things like low sodium or low calcium or potassium, which can actually lead to severe complications like seizures and stuff like that. So it doesn't necessarily rule out a lung or a heart condition yet. Also in that side story, they mention a cough and a fever. So with the cough ongoing and with a fever, it kind of sort of leans us to think that he may have some sort of chronic lung infection, or even lung cancer. Now, there's not too many causes of a fever outside of infection and cancer. Those are by far the two most common causes. There are rare genetic conditions that can cause fevers, but these are like extremely rare in people of Caucasian descent like Rion, so we can probably rule most of those out at this stage. So just recapping what we know so far. Rion had a complicated birth. He's been unwell since he was a child, and there's potentially some genetic predisposition from his mother causing his illness. We know that he's pale, fatigued, he's short of breath, he has coughs, he has occasional fevers, and he just looks pale and skinny. We also know that he had a seizure as well, which may or may not have anything to do with his chronic disease, but most likely it does. So after working out a bit of Rion's medical history from all of his stories, the next thing to do is a bit of a physical inspection based on his character models. Can we find any signs of disease in his costumes? So after having a general look at most of Rion's costumes, there's not really too much to find in terms of like signs of disease. All we can really say is that he's on the skinnier end, but he doesn't look so skinny that he looks severely unwell or anything like that. Another sign you often look for in people with chronic lung or heart diseases is like swelling of the fingers or hands, which we call clubbing. But in all of Rion's outfits, it looks like his fingers are like sort of normal thickness. He doesn't have big, thick sausage fingers. His face doesn't look discolored or blue, and he doesn't look like too white. When people look really white, we call that pallor, and that can often be a sign of chronic disease as well, or a sign of anemia, which is associated with chronic disease. So overall, just a physical inspection of Rion and all of his costumes doesn't give us any hints at all. So this is going to have to be solely based on his medical history alone. So we're thinking that Rion's disease is something congenital, affecting the heart or the lungs, which may or may not have been passed to him from his mother. He had the disease for many years, so it's a chronic disease until it ultimately led to his death. So when you think of a condition like this, the first one that comes to mind is cystic fibrosis, which is particularly common in people of Caucasian descent, which Rion most likely is. Other conditions we'd be thinking of would be things like acyanotic congenital heart disease, such as a ventricular septal defect, things like lung cancer, although that's incredibly uncommon in children, Hodgkin lymphoma, which can affect young people, leukemia, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, leading to pulmonary fibrosis, and asthma. We can slowly rule many of these conditions out. So firstly, lung cancer is extremely unlikely in someone, younger than 20, so we can pretty much throw that one out the door. Leukemia, also pretty unlikely. It likely would have led to his death much, much earlier, given that he's been unwell since birth and from a young age. Hodgkin lymphoma is still potentially what he may have. It's generally a less aggressive form of lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, and it certainly could have been something he had. Bronchopulmonary dysplasia, very unlikely. Usually that settles after a few days after birth. Could have definitely led to the birth complication which Rion experienced, but it usually resolves pretty well in most people. Asthma seems incredibly unlikely. You need some kind of allergy to be, affecting you. And the symptoms he described sound, chronic, like they're always there rather than coming and going, like asthma. Congenital heart disease, specifically acyanotic congenital heart disease, seems quite unlikely in his case as well. I think it's more likely we're dealing with, repeated infections of his lungs given the fevers, or potentially a cancer. So really we can round it down to cystic fibrosis and Hodgkin lymphoma. And this last piece of evidence, which I'm going to show, will pretty much all but confirm that Rion has cystic fibrosis. So let me explain why this last piece of evidence kind of confirms it for us. So in part 1 of Rion's Recollections of Dusk story, we actually find out some crucial information about his illness. So once again, we hear that he's exhausted, he's got a wheeze, a pallid face, all kind of generic signs of chronic disease. But right at the end, we find out that when he coughs, the scent of metal fills his head. Now, this can be interpreted in many ways. But the way I interpret this sentence is that when he's coughing up blood. Blood has that metallic scent, that metallic taste. It's highly likely that Rion's coughing blood. Of all the conditions we've listed so far, pretty much cystic fibrosis is the only one that will result in coughing up of blood, which is known as hemoptysis. Sometimes leukemias and things can do that, but as we mentioned earlier, that's very unlikely. Lung cancer would also do it, but again, lung cancer is incredibly rare in children and people of young age like Rion. We don't actually know Rion's age, but it's heavily implied that he's probably younger than 20, right? And just looking at his character model, I think he's of comparable age to Saryu, I'd guess, so, probably a teenager. But we don't really know yet. So why does cystic fibrosis fit with Rion's diagnosis? Well, firstly, it's a genetic disease and you have it from birth. Most importantly, it's a very common cause of perinatal or birth complications. Particularly if you're the mother, it can also lead to complications with the birth, but when you're a baby, it can cause this thing called meconium ileus, which is where basically the baby can't poop in its early days, which can lead to some severe bowel issues. So this could explain the reason why there were complications for both Rion and his mother around the birth. Additionally, all of his symptoms, fatigue, weight loss, shortness of breath, coughing up blood, etc., they're all potential symptoms of cystic fibrosis, as well as spiking occasional fevers. The seizure that Rion had could also be explained by cystic fibrosis, as it can cause severe sodium electrolyte disturbances in some cases, or he could have just been extremely infective and septic at the time when he had the seizure. Lastly, with cystic fibrosis, we don't really know what time period Rion grew up in, but it's most likely that he didn't receive, modern medical therapy, things like antibiotics. We now have really cool genetic-based medications as well, which I can briefly talk about at the end. But, before CF was treated, it would be quite common to die at a very early age, 25, 30. Rion's probably younger than that, but even in severe cases of CF, you can die before you're 20. Luckily, these days, thanks to a lot of modern medicine, people with CF will live well into their 40s, 50s, occasionally their 60s as well. So that's a little bit of good news out of this, I suppose. And then just in terms of cystic fibrosis, what it is, it's a genetic condition where you have this mutation in a certain transporter protein in your body. Basically what it results in is you have really thick mucus secretions in basically all parts of the body, not just your lungs where there's mucus. And this was first discovered in people's pancreases, which is the thing that controls your blood sugar. It's affected in diabetes. And when it was untreated in the past, it used to cause all these little cysts in people's pancreases, which is how the disease got its name. So it was actually named for its changes in the pancreas, even though most people would know cystic fibrosis thanks to the changes in your lungs. So essentially what it does is it causes thick mucus in the lungs that makes you much more susceptible to infection and pneumonia. Eventually it leads to heart failure as well. And I think in the part 1 of Recollections of Dusk, it mentioned how the disease was kind of gripping his weakened heart as well. Whether it meant just his emotions or his actual heart, who knows, but either way, CF fits. Another interesting thing with cystic fibrosis, as I mentioned before, it can affect your pancreas and your digestive system, is that you're unable to absorb as much food thanks to some sort of complex mechanisms, but you're unable to break down fats properly due to your pancreas not working. You're unable to absorb nutrients as well, which can explain why he was so tired and fatigued, and potentially may have explained why he appeared pale as well. Alright, so I think we've cracked Rion's case. It's most likely cystic fibrosis. If any of my subscribers have cystic fibrosis, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in the comments to see if you think Rion's disease lines up and to share any of your experiences. It's a very tough disease to live with, but fortunately these days it's a little bit more manageable, although it is still pretty tough. I've seen a lot of CF patients. I used to be a physiotherapist and work on a cystic fibrosis ward, so hopefully what I've said isn't anything too incorrect, but as always, fact check me, correct me in the comments, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.